if you want an insight into the madness that has destroyed Victoria, that's had millions of Melburnians shut in home detention for 3 months, it's got retail shops still banned for another couple of weeks, then look right now at this totally irrational, totally cynical tantrum that Victoria's Premier is now throwing at having New Zealand tourists visit his state.
People turning up unannounced should never happen again.
What a joke. How revealing this is of the Premier and his incompetence. Incompetence still of his whole team. I mean, you've got to ask what the problem is here. The Morrison government made a deal with New Zealand, now that infections in both countries are so low. New Zealand has just had 1 new infection in 3 weeks. So the deal was that we'd allow Kiwi tourists to come here if they hadn't been in a virus hotspot for a couple of weeks. This would help them. This would help our tourism industry, which is flat on its back. This would help us all get back to some normality, some semblance of it anyway. Win, win, win. And if we're going to get back into some sort of COVID normal, as the Victorian Premier keeps saying, this is what it looks like until we get a vaccine, weighing an extremely small risk against the real gain. But how much of our leaders, particularly a guy like Dan Andrews, really been driven by science? I mean, here's Andrews. He needs to distract attention from his horrible bungling of the virus, from the kind of really dodgy deals that Peter Credden was just talking about, deciding instead to throw a hissy fit to distract us. A hissy fit about this deal, about having 55 of these New Zealanders. Oh my goodness, these New Zealanders, these Kiwis, they've gone on from Sydney to Melbourne. They're in our city. Why wasn't he told?
That is not ideal, because members of Victoria Police, authorised officers and who knows who else have spent a considerable amount of time this weekend chasing up people that we were on the very clear understanding were not coming here because the bubble did not include us.
For heaven's sake, let's assume for the moment, big call, that the Premier is telling the truth, that this tourism bubble was never meant to include Victoria. It ruled it out. Excuse me, why? Why is Victoria saying yes to travellers from New South Wales, where there's far more infection than in New Zealand, but not to Kiwis? Makes no sense. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, his own Chief Health Officer, Brett Sutton, he saw no problem with letting in New Zealanders. Of course not.
New Zealanders are free to come to Victoria. The question is what the requirements are on arrival in Australia, and so the travel bubble, as I understand it, is that there's no quarantine requirement for those coming from New Zealand because of the risk status of New Zealand. But Victoria's open.
That was 2 weeks ago, but that was Brett Sutton speaking there, and I think by now you probably know this bloke. An example of why no one can trust anything the Andrews government, particularly the Premier, says or does about this virus. Sutton, by the way, is the man who also told that inquiry into Victoria's quarantine hotels disaster that he had no idea that these hotels were guarded by private security staff, badly trained, who then, not surprisingly, got sick and spread the virus. He never had any idea. Don't blame him, even though we've now seen him in another email thanking a health official in March for CCing him on a memo that explained exactly that. Private security guards were running the joint. Now, this same Brett Sutton is trying another trust me, I knew nothing kind of moment on us. He and his offsiders were marked down as present at a national meeting last week of health officials, which discussed this travel deal and the fact that it would mean New Zealanders going on to other states. The acting immigration minister, the federal guy, says he remembers that perfectly well and wonders how Victoria's Premier can now claim that he had no idea Kiwis would turn up at his door.
Brett Sutton was at that meeting. His deputy was at that meeting. There was a further meeting the next day where it was expressly raised also. Brett Sutton, the Chief Health Officer from Victoria, was again at that meeting. Now, you can't tell me that all 3 of those people at both meetings weren't present for the key moments.
But apparently you can say that, because you get more excuses from a Victorian government that's full of them. Sutton says, well, actually, he was late to that meeting and missed that bit about New Zealand. And the Premier says, well, so what? It's me that makes these decisions anyway, not bureaucrats. But then again, I was thinking, wait a minute, doesn't Andrews claim he's always following the advice of his health officials? But there you go. Yet another insight into the shambles that is Victoria's government. People running around like headless chickens while the control freak Daniel Andrews supposedly running the joint, making all the big calls, wants you to both believe he makes those calls, but then if something goes wrong, that he actually had no idea what was going on. No one told him. You're supposed to believe that. But I'm getting distracted, which is the whole purpose of this. What is this argument really about? About Kiwi tourists who pose about zero threat being in Victoria? No wonder one of them today was really ticked off.
It's been very stressful, and I've come for my father's funeral. I came over in good faith. You know, we didn't do a runner. We didn't all run away in, I'm sure, you know, we had a getaway car and we all dispersed over Melbourne. You know, it was all very, we just walked out and I came to my mum's place.
And yet this stupid controversy about nothing, this distraction, is important because it gives you an insight into the mindset of a Premier who is now keeping Victorian shops closed for yet 2 more weeks, even now that new infections are finally very low again. Just 1 new infection on Friday, 2 on Saturday, 2 more yesterday and 4 today. Those are the kind of numbers that New South Wales has dealt with for weeks without shutting down shops, thanks to its terrific contact tracing team. In fact, New South Wales today could relax some of its restrictions on pubs and restaurants. Now, OK, sure, good, you know, Victoria's Premier finally yesterday at least ended home detention for Melburnians after 13 weeks locked inside, but said they still couldn't have more than one family visit them at more than one time a day. And for some weird reason, they can't go more than 25 kilometres from home. I think you're thinking, well, so they can at least go 25 kilometres from home. Why only 25? That doesn't make sense. But anyway, what would they then do? Most retail shops must still stay shut for another 2 weeks with Christmas coming. They've been shut for nearly 4 months. 4 months. This time around, they were also shut earlier this year before they're allowed to open again. All going well, that is. Can you imagine the cost of all that? The lost jobs, the businesses that are going to go broke. The Federal Treasurer today was beside himself.
There's been a callous indifference in Victoria from the government to the loss of jobs and to the plight of small business. You see, in New South Wales, where they dealt with much more cases than we see in Victoria today, the cafes, the restaurants, the pubs, the clubs were all open.
And yet, and I don't understand this, that's bizarre. A psychologist should explain this to me. Victoria's Premier is still so sure of himself, despite all this government's catastrophically lethal mistakes that have caused the deaths of some 800 people now, caused the destruction of his economy. He's so sure of himself still that today he accused Frydenberg of just playing politics.
It's all about the politics with this bloke, isn't it? That's all he does. That's all he does. He's not a leader, he's just a Liberal.
Now look, Daniel Andrews is not alone in making this virus look far, far worse than it really is. I mean, it's serious, but not as bad as these guys are making out. And it's doing it either because it suits him politically or because it's got this strange apocalyptic mindset, I don't know. But West Australia's Premier Mark McGowan is also, well, just about almost as bad, a reckless fearmonger. I mean, this week saying his fear was of mass deaths. I mean, this is a state that's had just 9 virus deaths all year. Most of the victims very old, including cruise ship passengers and people who are already very sick. And now, McGowan's also grumbling about Kiwis coming to a state too. Kiwis who actually pose about zero risk, for heaven's sake. Do you get the feeling that some politicians are actually addicted to the virus fear? That they think that the more that they stir it up and they get all people, you know, all these voters head up and scared like crazy, the more votes they'll get? Or are they simply drunk on power?